Hi and welcome. Jerome de Groot is a professor of literature and culture at the University of Manchester. He studies the many places in which people encounter the past, like through novels, films, television, games, museums, family's history, and more recently, DNA. I will link a university profile to the description below. But Jerome, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I thought we could start first with your book, Royalist Identities. It was published originally in 2004. Examined some of the legal, social, cultural pressures faced by the support of the king during the English Civil War, and then obviously since then you've moved into the kind of the history of teaching history or encountering history. Mm-hmm. So how did you go from like 17th century
one to the other?
Yeah,
that's a very good question. So Royalist Identities is based on my PhD, which I did at the University of Newcastle, and that's about one place really. It's about the University of Oxford, or the city of Oxford, sorry, during the 1640s, which was the king's capital after he left London. So I was interested in that and doing kind of manuscript work and working on politics and poetry. So it's a fair question to then say, how did I then move quite substantially sideways? I guess the PhD was quite historically led, and my subsequent work was quite historically led. The kind of classic story that I tell, and I'm not completely sure whether I've told this story so many times it's become like the
its own law,
the memory rather than the actual thing that happened was. But essentially, I went to the British Library in 1999, and when I was sort of finishing up my PhD, well, had about a year left on my PhD. January 1999, I went into the British Library and I walked across the piazza of the British Library, and there was several hundred people in the piazza of the British Library in January 99, which is quite unusual. And they were watching a reenactment of the execution of Charles I, with reenactors and workshops and all kinds of stuff going on. And I trudged across that piazza and thought, I'm going in to write this PhD, which will be read by 3 people if I'm lucky, and there are hundreds of people out here engaging with exactly the same stuff that I'm interested in and working in it. So that was a germ of something, I think, to think about, well, how do we take our work out of the academy? How do we think about it? And also who does that work? Because most of the people involved in this reenactment were not, quotes, historians, and most of the people participating were not there to have an historical experience. So I was interested in the kind of flexibility of the identity of what are the people that do history. So that kind of sort of sat and, percolated for a while. And I wanted to write a book about kind of memory and the memory of the civil wars, and about kind of leisure and stuff, and all these things kind of got complicated in my head. So I started thinking about the way in which we remember now, and essentially that's I was given enough freedom at the university I was teaching at, which is this University of Manchester, to kind of develop this project in a way that I didn't really anticipate at all, and that's where the book Consuming History came from, basically. So it's kind of coming out of some intellectual work that was founded in my PhD, but really it was more kind of interested in what happens next, really. If you do this piece of extensive research, what's next? Where does it go? And then if you're interested in where it goes next, you've got to become interested, I think, in the cultural engagement with the past that we have, that is all around us. And I guess this is a very long answer. It's an interesting question because it's something I've thought about for years, and I don't really have an answer, which is weird because I was there. But I think also there was the sort of around about 2000 to about 5, there was a kind of expansion of history in culture. That sounds a stupid thing to say. There was a kind of very high profile engagement with the past. You think about Simon Sharma's series, you think about David, that guy.
Mary Beard.
Yeah, and then there was sort of quite a high profile TV series as well, and film, and so there just sort of was quite a lot going on around what, games were just coming out at that point that were quite, sort of Assassin's Creed and Call of Duty were just sort of quite big then. So I just sort of started collecting things that were interestingly about the past, and the more I did this, the more I was like, well, actually, this is extensive and really interesting and engaging, but there's very little work on it from our point of view. There's a lot of people doing public history, and there's a lot of people thinking about that, and I'm not saying that that's not a brilliant field. It's awesome. But oftentimes, particularly in the early 21st century, the conversation about this was, this is not very good, let's ignore it.
This way of thinking about history, you're quite early to what is now become normal in modern academia, which is the focus on history not just being in kind of silos of academia, but also being able to communicate that history. In the past, very often there was no concern for how history was communicated, and you're kind of early to that game of looking at how history travels from in the silo that can be academia into the public. And
I think it's quite crucial that I'm not an historian. And like I spent quite a lot of time in my first 10 years of my career saying I'm not a historian, but some of my best friends are historians. but basically and going into history departments and basically saying, doing my shtick or doing my talks or whatever, and getting, interrogated by people at some detail, and very much saying to myself, it's okay, I'm not an historian, I don't have to do this all the time. But like very much like, I'm from literature background, I'm interested in culture, I don't care whether the history is right. I do obviously have a investment in that, and we might talk about that later, but for me it's what's at stake in remembering. Why do we remember this way? Why have we decided to develop these ways of remembering, which we didn't have 30, 40, 50 years ago? How have we developed, how have we conceptualized what the past is and what the memory is? And so I think that I think that shift that's happened, as you're right, in academic history toward being more comfortable about the way in which history is communicated more broadly, I think that was kind of probably coming anyway because of this expansion of history kind of texts. I think it was coming in the UK because of the kind of expansion of research impact and knowledge, what was called knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer. Those are so embedded in what we do as scholars now in the UK that I think it would have been weird not to have that a concomitant kind of development. But also I think it just became more normalised. So when Sharma was doing his stuff in the late 90s, early 21st century, there was a thing when I was doing my PhD which is called a TV Don, and it was quite people were quite sniffy about people who were on TV a bit, and there were some people who were on TV a lot or on radio a lot, and there was this kind of sense that they weren't really doing proper stuff, and that communication wasn't that important. Whereas actually, since then, in the 20 years subsequently, people have done really interesting new work. Experimental history is much more common. Experimental ways of communicating are significantly more common, and there's a recognition of the work that film and TV and games and novels do. And it just like many more people doing it. I remember when Alison Weir wrote her first historical novel, and people were like, why is she doing this? She's a serious historian. And then actually it's now very common for historians to write historical novels or historical fictions or be involved in these things. And there's a whole load of brilliant scholars and brilliant practitioners who have done all this over the last 20 years, much more than I have, much more engaged than I have, and have kind of opened up that space.
Well, talking of the historical novel, you wrote a book of that name.
Yeah.
What made you get into writing that book in the first place? What was the driving force? What was the main kind of thrust of the book?
I sound really like I don't have an actual plan, because I don't have an actual plan. I finished writing consumer history, which I love doing, and it kind of flowed. And I don't know, depends on who. Sometimes things just catch, and it did, and it was not a difficult book to write. And it kind of just expanded. It kept on bigger, and I kept on adding more. I remember being in my front room and just reading stuff and thinking, oh, I've got to add that. Oh God, I've got to add that. and just so I remember particularly the stuff about. I wrote a whole section on metal detection, and I had a brilliant time. And I found out, I did a lot of work on the law around metal detecting and treasure trove as it was, and all that. And it was just so fascinating. So it just kind of it got bigger and bigger, this project. And it meant that the things that I thought I was going to write about as a literature person hadn't really had as much attention. So in the end, I didn't write about novels particularly much in that first book, which would have been my kind of bread and butter stuff. So I kind of went away and was asked at the time, this is just a sort of coincidence thing really, to do a new third year module. And for various reasons, I didn't want to teach an early modern module. That's a whole other story. So I decided to teach I'd just been doing this work on historical fiction. I was like, hey, historical novels are really interesting. And they kind of allow me to bridge. I can start in 1800 and I come to now, and I can do all kinds of stuff which will be interesting and engaging for the students. And so I did that. And so when I started doing that teaching, I was like, actually, I could write a book about this because I've got this material. I've got this model, which is how does history work in culture, which I had already kind of written about, and then I can kind of essentially expand upon that in a form that I really like engaging with. Sorry.
No, I like this playful way that you're bouncing around topics, and actually I think it's probably much more akin to how most people engage with different ideas and topics. Just people don't obviously get paid to do it and have that kind of luxury.
That is true.
But many people kind of see academia as kind of very much in a box, like you're an historian of ancient Rome or whatever, and that's all you do. But actually, if you have some very interesting ideas and you're willing to put the time and effort, you can publish on anything.
So this is a very interdisciplinary university, and it's very much encouraged to work collaboratively in inter and multidisciplinary ways. And there's very much less. Oh, that's unfair. There is pressure on you to do certain things, but there's much less assumption that you're just going to do the same thing again and again and again. Some academics are very, very brilliant at doing particular very small things. I cannot do that. It's not my temperament. It's not me. I can't do that detail. Whereas I like bouncing around, as you say, and doing big stuff and thinking through things, which, there are clear criticisms of that for all kinds of sort of dilettante issues. And also I don't, it's multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, but my theory of those things is not as robust as it might be.
I think that I really do believe there's a benefit to that because it, like you say, it allows you to cross disciplinary lines, which is increasingly important to really have a holistic picture of the things that you're looking at. If you're looking at certain parts of history through one lens, that very often can preclude other views and ways of looking at the same thing. And when it comes to this historical novel book, I mean, just a quick plug, in March 26, 16 years after you first wrote it, you've kind of come out with a second edition, but you have substantially widened its geographical range. You gave more female writers a more central place, new discussions on race, colonialism, gender, climate fiction and stuff. I wonder what about the first edition you felt. I mean, this goes a little bit back to what you were saying before, like it kept growing and growing, and maybe over that 16 years, it just kept growing in your mind and you kept thinking, I want to get back to this. But yeah, what made you go for a second edition? What about the first edition?
There you go. So like I say, the first edition came out of, this is sort of quite unfinished business in some ways, if that makes sense, which is what all, in my experience, good projects are like. You kind of like, I didn't quite nail that, or I didn't quite do that thing that I wanted to conclude, or I didn't, etc., etc. So I sort of expanded upon this project, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And again, this is a luck thing, I think, to a certain extent, or maybe it's a kind of, it's a luck thing. There was, again, an expansion of historical fiction. Historical fictions go in my version, go in kind of cycles. And there was, from about 2000 onwards, there was a kind of a clear cultural shift toward historical novels, which had been, for whatever reason, had been a little less popular in the later part of the 90s. So you kind of, if you think about so you have a boom in post-war, you have a boom in the 80s, you have a boom kind of in the early 90s, and then the early 21st century there was a kind of new mini boom. So you think about someone like Philip Gregory and the kind of intermediate work that she did, sort of the films that came out of her stuff. Someone like Sarah Waters. So you have a kind of an expansion of people writing these things. I'm then kind of going, this is interesting, let's do this stuff. So I kind of write this book quite quickly on the back of teaching this course. So it was kind of quite broad brush, and it was very much about kind of what this stuff did and how it worked on a kind of teaching trajectory. So from the beginning, and then with some kind of case studies and thinking about how we might complicate them with the model and stuff like that. So that was 2009, that came out. Subsequently, the study of historical fiction has expanded greatly. One of the reasons being that historical fictions have become more popular, but also they become more, like this goes back to the first sort of set of thoughts about history, they become more acceptable. So generically, people writing historical crime fiction or historical science fiction or romantasy or whatever like that, people are studying that, and that's kind of become acceptable. Whereas in the early 90s, when I was doing my PhD or when I was doing my undergraduate work, the idea that you might study crime fiction was kind of like that weird. So that book again hit a bit of a kind of wave of expansion of historical fiction, but not just about the writing of it and the reading of it, although that was that, but also the study of it. And so when I went back to this topic, having been asked by my publisher to sort of revise it briefly, they said, can you just update a few things? And I was like, I've got to rewrite the whole thing. And because I've spent the intervening 16 years working in this area and going to meet my colleagues around the world and talk to them, I was like, well, it's very clear that the book I wrote in 2009 is not fit for purpose in terms of what we think historical novels are now. I think it was useful then, and I think it's great. I really love that piece of work, but it needed to be substantially rethought given what's happened in the last 15 years.
I was going to say, what edition in this edition most changed maybe the family tree of the historical novel, or what do you think the most important kind of addition into this that made it?
That depends how honest we're being.
Off you go.
Well, going back over it, it was clear that I had written from a particular point of view about the development of the novel, and intervening, and scholarship before that, but also in the last 15 years has conceived of the novel and its development. So that is, you talked about the range of geography, thinking about this as a kind of European form, but also conceiving of the historical novel as something which has multiple implications elsewhere. That was as a consequence mainly of spending the intervening period in the department that I work in with and talking to my colleagues and learning from them. Thinking about this kind of model of the development of the historical novel as being very much a normative thing. It starts with Scott and then it goes through these people and then it becomes perfected by Hilary Mantel in 2009, and kind of wanting to not sustain that as much as I did in the first book. First book, I'm like, Scott's the greatest. And his Lukács who theorizes Scott, and then that becomes a kind of very standardized version. And I think I wasn't naive because I think it was what I thought at the time, but it wasn't as complex as it might be. And so actually what I did for this is, having spent 10 years being told I was wrong, which is fair enough, I then went back to the original text and started writing and thinking from a different set of perspectives. Scott obviously is an incredibly influential writer, particularly through the later 19th century, particularly globally, but he's not the only person to be writing about history. And let's think about alternative versions of this narrative. And also let's think that the idea of a narrative of the development of the novel is itself problematic, so let's disrupt that. So, there is an answer here. So I think what I did with this version that I'm most pleased with is that it's more than 50% based on the writing by women. I toyed with the idea of making it 100% about books by women or female writers, but that was mildly impractical for various reasons, and would have been a kind of weird state. I think sort of not weird. That would have been an unusual position to take. Not unusual. What do I mean? I would have had to justify why I did that, and I'm not sure I could have completely justified why I did that. But so it basically, based on some scholars that I really value, reading and thinking with them, I thought this is not in any way. This is presenting a very patriarchal, male-dominated version of what literary history is, and I don't believe that I should be sustaining that any longer.
Well, I'm tempted to defend the old Jerome because I think these are potentially two different books, and then
I think they might be. That's from my concern.
Yeah, I think they're two different books, and they're doing two different things, and I don't think either of them is necessarily incorrect. I mean, if you had, for example, written this new version with only women, you'd be missing out other parts. I mean, a lot of this stuff is about choices. I think what you wrote before, to me, seemed to be a fairly yes, normative, but a decent history of the novel. Grounded, yes, not fully comprehensive, but if you just read that book, you'd have a fairly good idea on how literature had advanced, etc. And like you mentioned just now, it's a lot of this is about choices, right? Who do you include, who you don't include? Otherwise, you'd end up writing, a 16-part series like the.
I wonder. I mean, I guess you're right. They are two different books, and actually, that's one of the problems that I think. Not problem. It's not a second edition. It's a different book. But so it was one of my colleagues asked me recently how they would use these books, and I was like, I think they are just different. I think it's about choice. I think it's about, as you say, but it's about how you emphasize certain aspects. I don't think we should only focus on particular writers. I guess my concern about only focusing on very much canonical male white European writers is that we don't get the full don't get full understanding of the complexity of what this thing is, and it becomes a standard normative thing. This is what a historical novel does, and part of what I wanted to do right in the first book, and indeed the second book, was to kind of stand up for that form and say this is an important and interesting form. It's a significant form. It's been around for 200 years plus, 300-400 years maybe. Historical prose or historical prose fiction has been around for longer and is multiply kind of used around the world. It's been used in conservative ways, but also in completely radical ways. If we just see this one version, then that doesn't help us particularly, but it also doesn't really recognise the complexity of what literature can do. The other thing that I think is I need to emphasise maybe in the third edition is I went back to Scott actually, and I reread some Scott recently, and Scott is bananas as a writer, and kind of like what the versions of Scott that come from Scott are much less interesting than no, that's untrue. Well, much less generically or aesthetically or tonally odd to our contemporary mind than Scott. So Scott kind of creates what you might call a normative realist historical novel, which we might recognise as what a historical novel does, although actually 19th century historical fiction doesn't do that as often as that you might think. But if you go back to Scott, you're like, this does not look like Hilary Mantel. Hilary's version of what a historical novel is so vested in manuscript research and work. She's creative, but she's so brilliantly taking that kind of research and really making everything feel so infused with it. Whereas you go to Scott and you're like, here's some ballads, and here's this bit over here, and then we're zipping over here, and then there's a bit of a romance story, and it's kind of like this has got. If you ask someone on the street what does a historical novel look like, they will give you probably some kind of sort of standard ideas. I don't think Scott does any of them. He's certainly not realistic. He's certainly not kind of coherent. He's really interested in certain things, and he knows a lot, and he brings it there, and they're brilliant books, and they're really fun, but they're kind of odd things, and he calls them romances, and I think they are romances. They're not novels, and so I'm not sure what this answer is giving you, but it's kind of like the idea is that
is there potentially a category error here, as in historical novels are such a broad thing that calling something historical novel is almost not descriptive.
100%. And that's one of the things I try to do in this new book, is to try and unpick that category and say, we've got quite overly concerned about the historical novel, and there are multiple books that are defining what the historical novel is. And for a long time I would give talks, and I would people would say, so what is an historical novel? And eventually I'm like, I don't care. No, that's unfair, but I do care, but I'm interested in the discussion about it. So I've had a long and ongoing argument with a colleague in France about whether Proust writes historical fiction, and they say Proust is not a historical novelist, and I'm like, that's ridiculous. Proust sits there in the contemporary moment and thinks about the past and renders it in fiction. That's an historical novelist as far as I'm concerned. But because they are more concerned with, as you say, a kind of a categorization, and also of avoiding categorization, because historical novels are still relatively kind of, because they're a genre and because they're often associated with certain types of writing, there are certain scholars who don't think that they're good writing. They're not good literature.
And hasn't that association changed quite a lot? So in the past, a historical novel was something loosely based in a historical period.
Yeah.
Whilst now you have this insanely researched stuff. It's the same with science fiction.
Absolutely.
Science fiction used to kind of be a fantasist's world to kind of think about alternative. And now you have these kind of very deeply researched, what's possible within the world of physics, etc. And it's the same in the world of history.
Absolutely. And it goes back to your question about why did I get interested in this stuff in the first place? Well, there are now, thousands of historical novels, from rewritings of Arthurian literature to trans-accounts of the 19th century to work written in multiple languages to diasporic writing. If you go into Amazon's historical fiction section, that way is madness. As far if you're me, because if you're trying to categorize this stuff and try and find a strand that brings it all together, you won't find one. But there is still this nebulous concept of an historical novel that, if you go to the Historical Novels Society yearly conference, and talk to all the people there, they think they're doing this, the same thing somehow. And in fact, one of the reasons I loved working on this is that that every writer who engages with history is doing something historiographically, and every time anyone does that, they do it differently. So you and I would write an historical novel about this event that we are, undertaking here, and we would do it in completely different things, different ways, and that would tell me as a scholar something about what we valued about writing the past and aestheticizing the past, and what was at stake for us in doing that. And I think that kind of individual historiographical kind of engagement is what makes it fascinating, because no one is similar.
Well, maybe as a lifelong project, you could do this sort of series of books where maybe you start with the spine, which is the normative. This is the history of the historical novel, and then this is all the. Then you can maybe in another book say, well, actually, this is what the normative looks like, but now we bring in all the kind of women writers, all these other, and then it kind of supports and enriches this tree as it sort of grows. Because, like you say, you can go down the road of picking any group, any kind of subdivision or category, and really kind of end up in the weeds on each one. But as someone who wants to kind of maybe learn about how these things developed and how they influenced each other, do you think there is a work out there at the minute that's doing that, that's allowing you to kind of both follow the spine of the historical novel and then also the various influences that influence that general path?
Do you mean a work like a literary work?
Just as a little bit like your first book, but a more comprehensive, almost chronological history and of the various influences of how it developed. So and so wrote this. He was influenced maybe by these.
So there's a brilliant book by a guy called Richard Maxwell from about 2011 called The Historical Novel in Europe, and he's excellent at recognizing limitations of this as a form, and basically saying this is a thing that developed, and here's how it develops, and here's how it gets kind of transmitted to various places. So he writes about Russia, he writes about France, and I think Italy. That's an awesome piece of writing, and that kind of goes a particular approach from Scott essentially, and he does write about the 18th century as well, and pre-Scott. So I think that's a really brilliant book. And then a kind of alternative book is Diana Wallace's book, Women's Historical Fiction, which basically looks at forgotten novels. So what Maxwell is interested in, kind of like Tolstoy and Flaubert and kind of big, as it were, canonical writers. Whereas Wallace basically says, the historical fictions were marginalised between about sort of 1920 and about 1960. Why is that? Well, mainly because they were written by women and for women, or that's her argument. And so in both literary history, not necessarily in popular terms, but in literary history, those types of writings become ignored because we're only interested in T.S. Eliot. I'm paraphrasing. And actually Diana's just about to publish a book about modernism, for instance. And in modernism, again, a kind of aesthetic which has been really changed and really rethought in the last 20 years, but also which is historically has been considered not to be interested in history, which is just, what? Ulysses is a historical novel. The end, full stop. But modernists are not meant to be interested in historical fiction, and Diana basically demonstrates that this is completely untrue, and there are hundreds of books written by card-carrying modernists doing really interesting modernist things about history. And what Diana's example I think is really good is it's like, why do we elect to think about certain things as being important and others as not? What we need to do maybe is be more interested in what's called a kind of distance viewing, which is like kind of not looking at that one book, Ulysses, and going, this speaks for everything, but thinking about the 400 books that were published about Ireland in the 1920s or whatever. And sort of then using that as a map rather than what we've been taught for the last 40, 50 years is good.
Well, let me ask a slightly sacrilegious question. In your first edition, you have a 1902 quotation from Jonathan Neal.
Oh my God, you really have done your homework.
He says, what right has the historical novel to exist at all?
It's a great question.
And to what extent do you think he was right? And what do you think the strongest case against historical novels are or can be?
Those are two very challenging questions. What right does it have to exist at all? It has a right because this is something we've invented to rethink the past. As a set of cultures, we're interested in the past. We speak the past in various ways. We dream the past in various ways, whether we are listening to Homer or the Homer poet, or reading Geordie Rosenberg, whoever, whatever you might be doing, you're enjoying the aesthetics of imagining a past, but also recognizing, I think there's a contract where you're recognizing that the past is being presented to you in a particular way, and that is something you are okay with. So there's a concept which is popular historiography, which is basically the idea that these things teach you how to think historically, and that's the value of them to a certain extent, if that makes sense. So what right does it have to exist? Well, we invented it.
So let me steel man the argument slightly. Yeah. Does that still... you basically say readers understand the bargain. But does that remain true when a novel about a certain period becomes the popular only encounter?
Well, exactly. So I was going to get to that, because that's... So on the one hand, they're very, very important. So, like I said, I don't care about the history in them. I care about the value of them, if you see what I mean, or the way in which they're valued, and what they can tell us about the way in which we might what we think is at stake in dreaming of or thinking about the past. Gone with the Wind is a really good example of this. And in fact, Gone with the Wind is a really good example of this. Margaret Mitchell writing this book. Margaret Mitchell claims that until she was 12, she didn't know that the South had lost the Civil War. She is a white supremacist. She writes a book of nostalgia. She has a copy of The Klansman, which is the basis for Mitchell's... I can't remember the name of the book. Something Nation. What's the name of the film? Damn it, it's not going to come to me. D.J. Griffiths. Racist film about the founding of both America and the Ku Klux Klan. So she's not just like writing about the South. She's invested in a particular memory of the South. She writes Gone with the Wind, which is massive success. Then becomes a film. It's a massive success, and that becomes a version of the South, and it feeds into the way in which the South remembers itself, to the point that. And as various other scholars have pointed out, when the capital was invaded in 2024, quite a lot of the kind of surrounding aesthetic was drawn directly from memorializing the civil wars, which went straight through Margaret Mitchell. So the case against historical novels is they can be incredibly powerful, and they can teach people hideous things about the past, and they can be... I think one of the reasons that historians oftentimes worry about historical novels is their emotive and imaginative power. And if that's in the cause of things that you're not necessarily happy about, then that's problematic. And I've had quite a lot of arguments with historians over the years about the duty to truth, for instance, and the fact that we shouldn't be allowed to make stuff up about the past, which I kind of get. I mean, and this is one of the big gaps in both the books about historical novels, is that I am a bit of a booster for the historical novel. I'm very positive about the historical novel. I think it's a good, positive thing. But, most historical novels, you could argue, are conservative with a lowercase c, and a lot of them are conservative with an uppercase c, and very politically kind of interested in a particular way of thinking, or a way, and very subscribed to particular, models of the past and of human behaviour. I don't think that's the case in the last 10 years, but it has been the case previously, maybe. And so the case against the historical novel is that it just perpetuates one way of thinking about the past and one way of imagining the past, or it perpetuates deeply dubious narratives about the past, which are destructive.
Too much to pull out there, so we'll take this one at a time. So, just to kind of push a little bit further on that steel, man. I mean, historical novels on people's private lives, people who might still, who still have family, or massive atrocities, like you mentioned, or vulnerable people, So it's not like the historical novel has nothing to answer for, and to some degree, his Neil's quote is maybe a little bit too far on its own, but it's not as outlandish as it first seems when read out. That the historical novel is definitely treading on maybe quite touchy ground. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
and some of it is deeply problematic for that. And I have a problem with it. So for a long time, I used to review books for History Today, and I would get my tranche of books sent through to me, and there would always be 2 doorstep books that were about war, and they were about the 19th century, and they were maritime probably, or they were about some prehistory. They would be possibly about Crusades, or they would be about kind of prehistory, Anglo-Saxon-y type. Medievalish, and they would be big books, for men about war. And I didn't know what to do with these books, because I was like, they're all not the same, but they're all, relatively, some of them are quite progressive and interesting, and some of them are just about, they're a kind of way of thinking about war and conflict and masculinity, but in, different clothing, basically. So how to make that a positive thing? Are these books just reminding people and men that they're aimed at that life is bitter and unfair and difficult, and you should be more manly about it to get through it? But then, so there's that. But I kind of like, well, the thought experiment that we all engage in reading historical fiction, whoever does it, is so weird in itself that I think it has a transgressive quality, whether you are reading Newt Gingrich's version of the American Civil War, or if you're reading contemporary trans fiction. I think they're not the same, but I think the peculiarity of reading historical novels and the peculiarity of that engagement with the past imaginatively and aesthetically and emotionally, for me, mitigates the fact that they might be politically unprogressive as far as I'm concerned.
And it's a genre. I mean, people are free to choose what they read. You sort of judge it on the merits of its writing, I guess, as opposed to the genre which you may or may not be a fan of.
Although, I mean, there's the use of medieval and classical past by the alt-right and right-wing contemporary in the last 10 years has suggested to me that might not be the case. We need to be a little bit more careful, and that's one of the things that's happened, because in between writing all my earlier books and now is the kind of weaponization of history, or the more explicit weaponization of history. Sorry, it's always weaponized, but history is never neutral, obviously. But the fact that history has become so pointed, which is why in this new book I thought I had to write about conservative historical novels, because I was like, this has now become a thing, and we have to recognise this. We can't just be like, isn't it nice that there are these nice novels about the undecidability of the past? There's actually a strand of writing out there which is sustaining a type of viciousness and a kind of clash of civilizations understanding of the classical world, for instance, which I think we need to call out.
Well, this is definitely something I will come to in a moment, because it's hugely contemporary and an important thing to discuss.
Yeah.
But before we move on, you mentioned just before this idea of the novel having a small c conservative background, if you like, and you do say this in your historical novel. You say, quote, conservatism, dissidence, complication and simplicity kind of all coexist. I wonder if you could give me an example of two novels that cover a similar period that lead readers into these two very different directions.
Oh man, I wish you'd asked me this so I could have thought about this a little bit.
I have put you on the spot.
No, you have put me on the spot, so let me think about... Well, I mentioned Philippa Gregory. Philippa Gregory's selection of novels about Tudor England are particularly generically specific. I don't really appreciate her as a writer. I think The Other Boleyn Girl has multiple faults, and I find it deeply problematic, particularly its representation of Anne Boleyn, its representation of family, its representation of Tudor England, etc. But massively successful, massively important in kickstarting a kind of Tudor boom. Hilary Mantel's book, which Wolf Hall trilogy, covers very similar ground in terms of the people and personnel, very, very different, both giving a kind of different version of the past and the ways in which we might understand it, both deeply involved with, as Mantel talked about, the body of the Queen and the body of the royal, both kind of questioning but also sustaining a type of Englishness which is translated through the Tudors, which has become then kind of a global brand. So yeah, they're both books, both types of books, both types of writer who are doing things generically. So Gregory is kind of a romance writer. She might argue with that, and fair enough. Mantel is kind of a, quotes, historical novelist, literary novelist kind of person. But yeah, they're different versions of the past are significantly different. Maybe that's invidious to compare someone to Mantel, who you might argue is the most important historical fiction writer in the last 10 years, 20 years. But certainly there are multiple other versions of the Tudors, all of which tell us something really interesting about why we might remember the Tudors. Quite a lot of them, that Tudor boom from about 2002 onwards, which is still we still have a tale of. If you think about the Tudors, the TV programme, you think about the multiple TV adaptations, this has been a big thing of the last 20 years. Quite a lot of that was kickstarted by Philippa Gregory, which is kind of interesting because she's like, I don't think she's an interesting writer, but I think she's got problematic versions of stuff, I would say personally. She's also an historian. She did a PhD in history. She advises on history. She's on the radio talking about history. She's actually very, very serious about her craft as a historical novelist. So to be rude about her is maybe a bit unfair, but I think those two types of writing are very different in their approach to what it is to be an historical novelist, and they give you two completely different versions of that moment. Have I got any other?
I had one just as you were speaking.
Yeah, go on.
It's not a novel per se, but I actually saw this as on a post of social media where someone mentioned Oppenheimer, which is the kind of great man history theory, kind of personified in a film, if you like, about the atomic project, the Manhattan Project in the US. The Chinese made an equivalent, similar film, but completely focused on the workers. So you have the kind of two opposite ends of like almost a Bruegel painting in a film where you're focusing on the kind of average guy contributing to this great project, and then in America, very Hollywood sort of traditional small c conservative great man theory.
Well, so Xu Teo, my colleague from Australia, wrote once that historical fiction is always historiography, and I think that's really clear. Is that actually what we're better at recognizing is that these texts are not neutral in what they're presenting, and that's a really good example of what are we emphasizing in our historical representation. Nolan has been criticised for all kinds of reasons for what he thinks about the past in the Odyssey, a made-up poem which he is presenting on film, But all of the arguments are fascinating to me because they're all about recognizing that representation is not neutral.
We will get to this, believe me.
But that's something which has happened in the last 20 years again, and I think that weirdly, quite a lot of the alt-right aggression toward wokery, etc., has served to demonstrate that actually no history is neutral, and it actually underlines. I mean, attacking the casting of the Odyssey just underlines that actually we have to be careful about how we present the past, but we make our choices, and our choices are these choices, not those choices, and that tells us as much as we want to about the people that we are interested in engaging with. So yeah, like emphasizing the Labour social history version or emphasizing the Whig great man version. I think our audiences are better at seeing them now. And particularly film. When I teach film with my students are so good at understanding film. They're so good at genre. They're so good at anticipating stuff. And I'm like, you're self-aware. No, so you're very aware of what's going on in film, and you know when you're being messed around or lied to, and you know a lot about representation. You care about representation. You care whether a trans actor is playing the Danish girl or not, and that's significant because you recognise that all these things are choices.
Yeah, there's definitely a completely different mindset. I mean, I'm very non-literate when it comes to films because I'm not a big film guy and I never have been. So I know I'm behind the door on these things compared to most people, but especially young people now. I think people are very literate and very aware of all the kind of behind-the-scenes choices, which used to kind of be completely unconscious to the viewer, are now almost.
Yeah, and I think that's. Also games, people are much more aware of games and people understand how games work. I mean, people understand how representation works a lot more, whether that's because we've become better at it or because we just live in a more media-fied landscape. It might have been that 30 years ago people were better at understanding, books, novels, texts, but certainly video and film is now, particularly with the rise of generative AI. I think that my students are very careful about film.
But is it also potentially because we've become more group conscious? I mean, there's more racial awareness, there's more self-awareness about which groups people belong to, whether it's gender, whether it's disability or other groups. This is something that was less prominent in the minds of people. So it's not just we are uncovering something that always was there.
Might have been less prominent in the minds of the white cis middle class scholars from 20 years ago.
But it was, I think across society there was much less self-identification to these kind of group categories that today. So we're not just uncovering something that was always there, potentially that was always there, but actually we are imposing something as much as we're uncovering something.
Yeah, I can see that. I can go with that. I think that despite the backlash against them, progressive politics in the sort of last 10 years, particularly around queer and trans rights and rights around race in the US have had an effect, and they have had the effect of people being aware of and responding to, reacting to, and comprehending their situatedness.
And people could argue for both positive and negative reasons. I mean, it's also spawned a huge kind of backlash in terms of people who had never really had race identification, who now suddenly are, identifying as part of certain groups, and it's created huge amounts of tension. So it's not, these things always have a kind of opposite reaction. So that what I'm saying is, these are not just things that have always existed which are being uncovered or given an airtime.
But yes, but also that's in some ways what the kind of last 20 years of history and popular history has done as well, is kind of raising people's awareness in museums or in film of the multiple stories that aren't being told or aren't being understood and seen. And I think maybe in the West, when I did a project on contested history around the world, you suddenly realise that actually, this discussion that we're having about group consciousness and identity that's been had in Mexico, that's been had in Indonesia, that's being had repeatedly in Russia. There are global contexts for the sorts of discussions that I've had, and the way in which history is understood and used in many of those locations is really important, and has been and always has been recognised in that way. Whereas I think in the UK, until about 2010, there was a kind of clearer assumption that British history was relatively neutral, and that's because of the way it was taught.
I mean, this is a huge Western export, this kind of what you can call identity politics. But I mean, very often the British Empire is blamed for reanimating group differences, whether it's in India or parts of Africa between different tribes. And the idea of awareness of differences between groups is always a kind of positive thing, which it can be used for, like you say, representation, etc. But it also has the ability, like we saw in Rwanda and other places, in India and Pakistan, in times of partition, whether a lot of those divisions happened before, there's a huge blame levied at the feet of the British in that regard, because they reanimated these things. So that there is definitely a strong argument from the other side of this debate to say that these things don't just have the positive connotations of including people, where actually what you could be doing is creating huge issues as well at the same time. So that I think this is maybe a conversation we come on to in more detail later. It's a very interesting very interesting conversation. I mean, you wrote a recent article, and with a fantastic title, I have to say. It says, "While the events of this story are fictional, these people existed." And just going back briefly to the historical novel, I wonder if actually writing disclaimers like that actually add some kind of...
that's from... oh God, I can't remember the film. It's from a film about black cowboys that Netflix produced a couple of years ago. That's an article about anachronism. And it's about the creative use of anachronism, which is, So it takes on board the discussion that's being had right now, which is people being angered by representative casting, basically, like the Odyssey, for instance, and particularly the casting of trans actors and black actors in that. And I think that title it's tongue in cheek, because it's basically saying, we are rendering account. We're basically saying, there were people that we would categorize as black in the 19th century in the US. There were Chinese, Asian communities, there were black communities, and they have stories to tell. Ryan Coogler's film Sinners, I really enjoyed that last year for this, because I think that is so confidently basically saying, here's a whole history that there's never been committed to celluloid. Sorry, that's a fancy phrase. There's never been on screen. And we're going to kind of ignore white history because it's not important. And in fact, the white characters in this have their own history. They have kind of history into Europe. But they're actively preying on us. They're actively, they're vampires. They're extracting. They're vile, and they're turning us. They're destroying our communities intentionally. So let's tell our own stories, and I think that's kind of these people existed as, on the one hand, sort of part of a Black American film and TV kind of category right now, which is interested in representation and interested in playing around with, talking about stories that have never been filmed. But also, it's a bit of a fuck you, politically, but it's also basically saying, well, what's your questioning about the accuracy here? This is a film about cowboys. It's a film about a heist. Why do you care about quotes representation and so putting into question our discussions around authenticity in history, which gets us to some really interesting questions, because it's like, well, who's making those claims about what is authentic and what is real and what is true, when you're telling a story about people robbing a train? Does it matter? Yes, it does. But and so that little phrasing basically is very clearly saying this matters, but it also doesn't matter at the same time, and it's very provocative, and I really appreciate its provocative aspects. This is the big debate of the last 10 years is about representation and about who gets to be on screen. And you're right about whether identity politics becomes divisive, but Sinners is a really good example of a terrifically successful movie which played around with politics and did some really incredibly interesting things with temporality and linearity. There's a whole sequences which are out of time. There's whole sequences in which music is used to connect to deep history, and not just black history, but non-white history. And part of it is reparative, and part of it is about just telling those stories, and that being a way of addressing trauma and addressing the destructive nature of white supremacy. And part of it is just about cleaving away from this tradition of the Old West and it being white, and saying, well, we do our own thing. This is a new version of it, whether you like it or not. We can rewrite your rules and redo things. So I think that's for me is really fascinating, and there's quite a lot of TV and film which are doing that. Then it's not anything particularly new. Using anachronism in this way has been done for hundreds of years, but it is new now because it has a newly pointed way of arguing about politics.
Do you think there's a big difference between representation, as in making a film about black cowboys or whatever, and doing it in such a way that I won't repeat, but in your words, are kind of like screw you to what is another group of people, which obviously is then going to build resentment, and then you're going to have a go. And that's how you kind of build up that sort of...
Is it resentment? I think it's... Yeah, I think it is it's provocative.
And there's huge resentment coming back now from the other side, from people who feel like, I'm a poor, white guy in the South or whatever it is, or in some rural community somewhere, and they are feeling, they log on to Netflix, and like you say, I wonder if there was a difference between, just making something that was allowing other groups to feel represented, and there's a difference between that and maybe making other people feel sort of
yes, but that's and that kind of exclusionary aspect of political art, I can see that. Obviously there's going to be there are implications for people who feel excluded, and the
question is, are we sowing a future which gets increasingly dark, where different groups start to kind of stand up for their own? Because obviously until now, the idea was that whites were the majority, they were in power, if you like, and therefore there was never this idea that whites would ever feel, under attack, if you like. But as these things change, both in demographics and just day-to-day life in all parts, especially in the US, we're seeing huge kind of pushback. Do you see any sort of danger in that other side of that?
I don't think I'm qualified to talk about that, really. Do I see danger in that? Probably. And you're right, it's been weaponized, it's been created, it's weaponized in this country.
And this is part we'll get to later when you talk about the alt-right and all these kind of new histories that are coming out trying to kind of resurrect
absolutely. And this kind of, and a sense of sort of left behindness or being unimportant or being ignored, certainly. Yeah, I think that is dangerous. Whether that's the same as filmmakers from the black community making movies that tell stories about black experience, and that being the reason for that feeling of left behindness.
No, but that's why I divided the idea of
I think
representing people is kind of one way of doing it, and then there's also definitely ways of doing that are more kind of provocative in a way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I mean, so Sinners won many Oscars last year.
I have to say, I haven't watched it, and I know very, very little about it.
Well, many Oscars last year, and you're right. Sinners is part of a set of movies like, for instance, Get Out or Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Slayer, which suggests the kind of the South, the American, the white community in the American South are basically vampires of some kind, or preying upon black community. There are infinitely small number of movies that do this, and if you went onto Netflix and you watch movies, there are a gazillion films which are presenting still a normative version of the past.
But you won't in common. I'm saying you won't in common find films that are particularly targeting a demographic, saying this demographic of vampires against it's a newer.
Netflix is it's an interesting question, because one of the things that used to be the case is that we all had a slightly more curated experience because we would all watch BBC or Channel 4 or whatever, or CBS. Now with the explosion of on demand but also streaming, That's not the case. And so actually, it's vanishingly rare that you would have kind of that everyone would watch the same thing. I mean, an example of this discussion, which is massively successful, is Bridgerton, which, you know, we can get into the detail of the weirdness of what Bridgerton thinks it's doing as a program, but you know, fundamentally that's a Regency historical show which has quotes colourblind casting, which is staggeringly successful. And in some ways, yeah, we can be concerned about the communities that feel left behind and feel they're not being represented, but actually the success of Bridgerton demonstrates that actually diverse casting and inclusive casting firstly don't necessarily matter, or actually are what audiences want to see more.
And a different model of representation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and as we come up to another, I mean, it's Austen's, is it this year or last year? I can't remember, sorry. I think it's last year, Austen's a centenary. I should know this. It's a centenary of her death. Centenary of her birth. 250 years of her birth, probably last year or maybe this year. Probably last year. I should know this, sorry. Insert information here. But so there was loads of interest in Austen, for instance, and they made loads of shows. The other Bennet sister, it must be this year because they came out this year. The other Bennet sister, Miss Austen, I think was. There's various things happening. There's another Pride and Prejudice coming out, etc., etc. They are to a person white actors, and you're like, okay, well, Bridgerton completely changes the game. Well, actually, it doesn't, because then you've got the BBC casting Keely Hawes as Jane Austen's sister, and you're like, well, that's fine. But we haven't. I mean, not much has changed. There are quite big, kind of scary things over here. Like, where people think, oh, everything's changed. Like, well, actually, no. People are still imagining Regency England in exactly the same way somehow, which I thought wouldn't be possible after Bridgerton. But it obviously hasn't had the impact that I think it has. But
I think there could be space for both of those things.
Absolutely,
surely.
Absolutely. But it just felt really weird. I was doing this bit of research recently. I was looking at the stuff that was made to. Recently, the most recent Austens, and there's a hallmark Pride and Prejudice film which is majority black casting, but other than that, nearly every single film recently has been Regency England is notoriously white. I mean,
which it historically was, and some people care about this sort of stuff,
exactly.
and other people don't. I mean, you've got what's his name? He's quite an old actor now. He did the Scottish. The historical movie in Jesus, what's his name?
Jesus.
I can't remember. Insert name here. But anyway, very, very concerned about historical accuracy and stuff. And then there's just storytelling, which people are not that concerned about.
But it gets you back to the question you asked right at the beginning about the fact that the historians are more comfortable with this type of historical representation nowadays. So they're more comfortable with quote inaccuracy, or the potential for inaccuracy, or the potential for things that aren't necessarily true. And one of the reasons that historians are more comfortable with that is that they're more comfortable with a discussion about what it means for us to represent the past in particular ways. And so to see that creating a TV series or a comic or an advert or a museum installation, all these things depend on decisions that are historiographically led, and they depend on an understanding of what the past is and its importance, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that the debates around accuracy and identity are versions of debates around accuracy that we've had for hundreds of years, which is about who gets to tell what story and why, really, and whose truth are we accepting.
Yeah, and I guess this is another reason why more group identity awareness makes all of these things more complicated. Mm-hmm. Because in the past you might have different representative groups involved, and no one really noticed or cared all that much. And now you have a very loud group of people going, oh, this is not fair, this is our history, this belongs to us in some way, and other groups saying, well, this is our history. And then you get I know some meme recently, when they make some like a Regency film or something from white history, and they put ethnic minority actors in it, and people are saying, well, would you do it with Nelson Mandela? And then they get this whole debate or argument about who owns the history, etc., etc. So like I say, just from a perspective of a bystander, it just seems to me that from when I've become aware of this sort of world, maybe in 2008-9 till today, there's become an increasingly insanely toxic environment around all these things, driven by group identities. And it started off fairly innocuous with, maybe oppressed or ethnic minorities getting group identity, but that's spreading, and now nothing can be produced or released without there being huge debate about.
So there's lots of pushback. So Wuthering Heights is a good example of that from this year. Yeah, Wuthering Heights came out this year. But I think, Wuthering Heights kind of anticipated this. But they were very much that this is a version of this. Wuthering Heights, the title is in quotes. There was very much, and that's a book. It's a book of fiction. But the fact that Heathcliff is intended to be, I think the quote is swarthy. The idea is that Heathcliff is not white in the novel. That's been taught for the last 20 years. That's pretty much a standard interpretation, which I would teach. But then casting thingy, very tall man, whatever his name is, I can't remember his name, Jacob Elordi, as Heathcliff then became very controversial. And yeah, I think that the argument about representation is still so ongoing, and I think the Scottish actor that we both can't remember has a certain amount. There is a certain point about acting is acting, but also representation is crucial. And most of the people who are making noise about most of the people that are not being represented are still not being represented. It's still vanishingly rare to have black actors in key roles or lead roles in historical films, and that still does present a version of the past which is very much one version, which is it looks like us. What's a really good example of this that I like? Have you seen Prey? Don't
ask me if I've seen something, because almost certainly the answer is no.
My go-to films are for kind of doing something really interesting. So Prey is the Predator. So there's set of films using a character called Predator. Predator is an alien who visits visits worlds to hunt.
I was going to say, don't tell me they're arguing over who Alien belongs to.
No, but Alien versus Predator actually does happen. So Prey is set in the 16th century in North America, and its central characters are native peoples, and it's just an excellent example of there are white European settlers there. There are redcoats there as well, but it's kind of not interested in them. They're kind of on the edges, and so it's just a way of telling a story about a very big franchise character that is Predator but whilst it kind of ignoring that kind of standard history and doing something different and new.
This is definitely a conversation that could go on, and we'll probably pick up some of this in a bit. When you first published your book Consuming History in 2008, this is a book which is literally about what we've been discussing, how people encounter and use history outside universities, celebrity historians, family research, museums, reenactments, which might have been the thing that, inspired you to go down this road, television and games. Third edition, little plug, is now due in 2027. And without giving too much away, if you're writing the book from scratch today, are you doing another version of what you did?
No, it's less. That's a good question. So the book was 2008. I then revised it in 2016, and I'm revising it again. Quite a lot of the revision is simply updating. And to go back to what I started with by saying there's been this kind of boom, there is so much, like both in the way that we imagine the past, both in the ways that we access the past, and multiple things in between, that has changed in the 20 years since I wrote the first book and the 10 years since I wrote the last one. That quite a lot of it is just that. It's just updating and saying, well, okay, so documentary has changed in these ways. Games have changed in these ways. Some things haven't changed particularly. I've still got a section on quizzes, which haven't changed much, or Trivial Pursuit, or metal detecting. Those things haven't massively changed.
How about social media? Have you added that in?
Yeah, so social media has been added in. So I've got some sections on AI, and particularly new AI history, which I think is really fascinating. But yeah, so there's a whole section on digital, which when I first started writing this in 2008 was pretty small. It was about websites, and now it's like everything. So that's interesting. And I'm not massively digital native. I don't use much social media or as much as I used to. so I know less about that. So that, I'm more concerned about that. But yeah, it's not the complete rewriting. I always think this book has good bones. You know, it's got a good structure, so it sort of sits quite nicely. So all I need to do is update some bits and add in new bits. That makes it sound really easy. It's not, but like it's just like basically saying, okay, here's a section on historical film. What's happened in historical film in the last 10 years? There's no point in a book which is often used in teaching talking about, you know, films that were produced in 2005. Although actually now everyone can access them, so it doesn't matter. But you know, I'm not going to talk about Saving Private Ryan, although I will. It's a great movie and it's really useful. But if you're going to talk about what's happening now, you need to talk about the last 5 years or so. So yeah, there's a lot of rethinking and updating. The most fascinating thing for me is that reality TV and the internet in 2008, when I wrote about them, were very positive things. So the first series of Big Brother and reality history, which was a kind of thing then, it's not anymore really, were really interesting about centering the experience of a normal human being rather than a presenter or a celebrity. They were really interesting things. Internet stuff was really interesting. The opening up of the net, beginnings of social media. They were about access. They were about engagement. They were very, very positive. I don't think I will be writing that version of this book anymore. And later, so I read loads of sort of media history and thinking in sort of 2006 or so when I was writing this was very positive. I mean, kind of like critical, but like lots of media scholars were thinking about the positive aspects of what the internet could enable. And there was a sort of worry that it would be owned by corporations and your access would be controlled, et cetera, and there might be toxic aspects in it. But I mean, I don't think anyone really foresaw quite how prevalent that would become and quite how dangerous that would become. And I'm not going to get into why those things are because I'm not a media expert. But like, that's been the thing. That's the transformation. That you can't write into 2026. You can't write about social media in the same way as you might have done in 2008. It just that's just. But watching that shift has been kind of interesting. So yeah, I think the new version which I'm writing at the minute has got lots of extra stuff that I've added because I've discovered it, and there's more to write about. I just wrote a whole lot about late 90s Disney films, which I kind of not, because I'm writing about animated and graphic film, and of which there is a lot more now than there was, and so I'm trying to do a little history. And of course, if you look at the late 90s Disney films, they're all about history. Like they're obsessed with history. They're adaptations of Dumas or their actual, their Asian history. So they're kind of, it's just there as a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? As a kind of inheritance for who is making movies now. Where did I start with this? Yes, so the book is really fun. I'm transforming it a bit, but it's going to look quite similar to the last two. It's not going to be as dissimilar as the historical novel, but there will be about 30 or 40,000 new words, so it's quite a lot of new stuff.
That is a lot of new stuff. Following a little bit from the point you made about the change of attitude to the internet and social media, having followed the sort of all the way from the hope days of 2008 and how almost the internet and social media was almost seen as a tool of the left-wing establishment, if you like, and now it's seen as a tool of how it's transformed from this hopeful thing into this cynical thing, and it's gone from being a kind of left-wing thing to a right-wing thing. I wonder if the attitude from hope to cynicism is somewhat reflected in the book as well.
Oh, I really so I worry about that. I worry that I'll become cynical. I mean, when I did write these books originally, I was much more positive and idealistic, and I don't want to be like negative. And I don't think I am, but yeah, certainly. This is a good example. So there are other things which are much more. Things have changed brilliantly in all kinds of stuff, and lots of stuff that I bemoaned in 2008 has changed significantly in 20 years' time. Like the fact that there are only men presenting history on TV, that's changed quite significantly. For instance, so there is things do change and things change positively. Social media. I don't think anyone could argue that was. I mean, there's still quite. I mean, if you take out Twitter, then there's still a lot of positivity around social media in terms of communication and teaching. There's a lot of stuff that museums use social media very, very well.
Take social media out of social media.
There's a problem, isn't there? But so I don't. Yeah, I think the question is about the thing is about disaggregating. We can't put the genie back in the bottle, so it's there, right? So can we build a version which is more akin to what the idealistic version that we thought was going to happen in 2008? I don't know. I
have to say, for me, like, this is not a platform for my views, but I'm quite positive about what's happening. I think, yes, we get to see the sort of darker side of things, and there is a discussion about how to, for example, identity. Do we force people to have identity online, etc., etc.? But in general, I think it's spread power. It's made the world more democratic. To see if it's a good or bad thing, this stuff terrifies people in power, and to me, that's always a good thing. If you look at any people who are either dictators, but even not, even just generally people in power, whether you go from all the way from a full on, a Lukashenko to an Erdogan, all the way up to Prime Minister of Iceland. No one likes social media if you're in a position of power, and that can't be a bad thing.
No, absolutely. And the use of Twitter in the Arab Spring and the use of online stuff, yes, certainly. But
but that's always going to come with that flip side of you. It's a bit like free speech, Free speech allows for new ideas to be explored and created, but that has to also allow for very avant-garde things, which might not be tasteful, to also be explored, because ideas are always fringe when they are not orthodoxy, and then when they become orthodoxy, So whether Galileo, in his day, he might have been. Plato is a great example. Plato in his day was basically the equivalent of a Nazi after 1945. So they had just had, the democracy was overthrown. He was a student of a man who had just been killed because he had tried to undermine the democracy. So he is basically the enemy of everything, they stood for, and it's Plato. So, in the time he was writing, he was the enemy, and certainly his teacher and the person he was most inspired by was the enemy. So it's very often you don't know in the time what exactly is. Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right about the potential for social medias. So, what do we mean by that even nowadays? Like when I was writing the second version of this book in 2016, there were like 3, and now it's like everything. So a really good example of that would be podcasts like this. So historical podcasts are really interesting. They're huge. They're going through a kind of concretizing at the minute, which is mildly worrying. So like maybe 10 years ago, the historical podcasts were quite punk, they were quite DIY, they were quite rock and roll, they were all the good things, all the radical, interesting stuff.
And this is very DIY, just in case anyone's wondering, this is as DIY as it gets.
Very meta. And exactly. So and it's because the technology means that you can do this really relatively to a very high level, but also anyone can do it, and the top podcasts across the world are a kind of mixture of that kind of DIY aspect of it, and increasingly corporatization of that. And if you think about the way in which particularly in the US, podcasts have become such big business that they're now being kind of taken over and kind of made much less interesting as far as I'm concerned, but there's still, because there are thousands and thousands you can find your podcast, and that kind of proliferation and that expansion I think can only be good. And so everything that I argue in these books is always about challenging gatekeepers and challenging the people who claim to have authority. Social media and digital access of all kinds does that brilliantly. It oftentimes then gets kind of taken over, for want of a better word, and podcast is a good example of that. The podcast didn't make anyone money until about 8-9 years ago. Now they're insanely profitable, and with that comes all kinds of other stuff, and because they're not nationally, because there's no kind of national, what's the word I'm looking for, like strategy like there was with TV and there kind of was with film, you've just got this explosion of stuff that's kind of fascinating, and just seeing how it works is kind of cool. And the same with social media, because they kind of developed and grew like not organically but without kind of rules. Basically, it's interesting to see what they've enabled, and some of them enabled really good things and some of them more problematic things.
I'm sure the audience is not wondering, but not a penny is made on this podcast. But I mean, to your point, you conclude in your book, I think it's page 248, you say the Academy no longer has a monopoly on historical knowledge.
Do I? That sounds very, very impressive.
But we will get to what we were just talking about, the kind of pros and cons. I mean, like in the podcast space, you've got your sort of, very well-regulated, corporatized podcast, which makes sure you don't say anything sort of crazy. And then you've got your sort of Candace Owens on the other end, who's just completely nuts, but she's got a huge podcast and people love it. But I think I was thinking maybe we can start by looking at it this way. Opening history to more people is obviously a gain. That's
in the same about that.
Yes. But the thing is, academics, normally, they have references, they have named sources, there's some form of scrutiny. I mean, online, the strongest rewards normally go to novelty, outrage, clicks, certainty definitely sells. Now, obviously, every person has a choice what they want to watch, and that's important, and we should be educated enough that people should want uncertainty that's true over certainty that's sort of nonsense. But there is, don't you think, and we'll cover the other side of this, but just from that point of view, we're going from a kind of gated, but to some degree, gated from complete craziness to a free-for-all where the incentives might be quite perverse.
Yeah, I don't really have a response to that other than I think you're right, and I think that this is the change, and this is why I don't want to be cynical in this most recent bit of the thinking, but this is the change that maybe has happened in the last 20 years, that the gatekeeping of all kinds has been challenged. That's a positive thing, absolutely. Opening up access is a positive thing, absolutely. There hasn't necessarily been a concomitant intellectual bit of work on the part of the left or the progressive thinkers or the academy or whatever to kind of influence that, and it's just been left to grow, and that's kind of cool. But I think partly this is like me saying the academy is not in charge of history anymore. One of the reasons I started writing these books, and one of the reasons I had those arguments when I went to history, was I was like, you can't ignore this. You should not ignore this. You should be part of it, because if you're not part of it, it will happen anyway. And it's going to happen anyway without you being involved. And historians, I think, have laudably done quite a lot of work recently. But in some ways, the cat's out of the bag. They can't, there's because they weren't, no, that's untrue. I'm not saying that it was their fault, but as a set of communities, we didn't necessarily think this through. And without thinking it through, you get, mutation and you get complication and you get all kinds of, and some of that is crazy and brilliant and some of that is toxic and awful. And I wonder whether part of the discussion was about what free speech is and what it is that we have to talk about, and what we label. I mean, in the US, like podcasting culture in the US is kind of toxic, and that's weird that that's happened in this kind of radio wasn't toxic in the 50s when it kind of became this massive, the 40s and 30s. TV didn't become toxic, really. Film didn't become toxic, really. Why is this particular sort of set of media has become so potentially open to
well, isn't the answer
toxicity?
Isn't the answer in what you said before? I mean, I noticed very interesting. You said the left and the academy sort of dropped the ball on this one. To some degree,
that's unfair, but
to some degree. But I find that kind of quite interesting because it sort of leads on to what I was about to say next, which is, are the universities and the academies really neutral gatekeepers? And to your point about because there's funding, academic fashion, academic politics, they all determine which direction, what gets attention, what gets funding, And you mentioned why do podcasts, why have they become so toxic? Because there are no gatekeepers, and to some degree, there's this yin yang. The gatekeepers are great in some degree that they keep out some of the craziest, nastiest stuff, but they also keep out other things, which, when there is no gatekeeper, absolute gold can kind of shine through, and you have the huge positives that come with the democratization, but we have to be willing to take those costs, because as soon as you give power to people, you're going to have all the sorts of things that people are capable of coming through, and that includes the good and the bad. But like you say, the academy itself is not neutral, nor was the people controlling film, nor was television for all these years neutral. They had people with certain views of the world deciding how that was represented. And now that they're gone, you could argue it was a nicer overall world we were in, but you can't say that it was more accurate or...
No, 100%. But yeah, if you think about you think about documentary, you think about BBC, and you think about kind of Reithian values and the idea of the BBC being founded on, you know, the kind of the idea of just one man, Reith, and his version of what broadcasting should be. So certainly that, and those values are still enshrined in the BBC, but they are they're coming out of a kind of world of the 1930s, 1920s and 30s. So thinking about Reith and documentary is a good example, because, you know, documentary had all these kinds of claims to truth and education, which were never real, because like even Nanook of the North, which is like allegedly the first ever documentary, had fabricated bits in it and was made by, you know, kind of white saviour kind of people sort of about this native person and the end of a way of life, etc., etc. There's always one way you could criticise it. Yeah, I don't know the answer to this. I really don't, and I hope that I do get toward more of an answer by the time I finish this book that I'm writing, because is the question, did we just enable... Sorry, what am I saying? Is the question, democratisation is de facto good in every situation? I think probably I would always argue yes, but how is that then... I'm coming from a white liberal progressive set of politics, and when people use a democratisation that I think is good in a way that I don't agree with, how do I articulate a response to that, which is true to some of the ethics that I'm talking about?
And isn't this really the conversation about free speech ultimately? Democratisation and free speech are kind of they're both the same thing.
It's about that, but it's also about ethics in the past. I think it's about how do you enable an ethical way of thinking about and representing the past. Because you said, you know, if you let everything open, then gold comes through. But I think, for me, oftentimes about democratisation of history is about creating an ethical approach which enables diversity, inclusivity, multiplicity to be the focus of what you're doing.
But surely that's an impossibility, in the sense you can't impose a value system on...
Well, you can.
on the chaos that is free speech. The idea of democratisation is everyone gets a voice, and that is the...
Well, this is the problem I have. Yeah, exactly. This is my concern is that I am only... I want things to be in one way, but I'm idealistic about them, and that has not been the case in the last two decades. So I don't want to be cynical and go, oh, everything's terrible. I don't want to be old and go, oh, everything was better. I don't really believe either of those things. But certainly the consequences of some of the democratisation that I would be very positive about have not necessarily been what I would have wanted them to be as an individual. But again, going back to what I'm talking about, I'm observing, I'm analysing, I'm not necessarily moralising. I might moralise about Twitter, but you know, but you know what I mean. More for me is about the interesting is about, okay, well, we enabled, you know, the opening up of particular ways of thinking. Well, where has that got us? Podcasts again, good example. Multiple brilliant podcasts about all kinds of interesting new things, from this one to all kinds of podcasts about individual approaches. Podcasts have a kind of tendency to be kind of irreverent. I think that's brilliant. They tend to be kind of really good at communicating particular things. They're interested in narrative. They tell us all kinds of things about the way in which people want to learn history right now, or engage with history right now. They're funny. That's sort of not normal in other history. If you look at documentary history, if you look at film history, funny history is not standard. And I don't mean comedy history. I mean history in which there is jokes or people are funny about the past. All of this stuff is really fascinating and really useful and interesting. So I wouldn't disavow it. But I do. I'm more worried about the consequences of this democratisation than I was, I think, 20 years ago.
Well, let me try and cheer you up. Maybe, and very often when these things get quite dark, I tend to try and think that the reason why this is difficult to deal with is the time frame. Things have cycles. And we've watched a few of those cycles over the last 15 years of social media. You know, you see sort of fashions of ways of thinking, or fashions of like on social media. They come, they go, and what was like hugely popular one day, the next day is kind of mocked and derided. And I think if we give it a long enough time horizon, lots of these things which are being empowered by the openness, by the democratization, by the freedom of speech, for people to say crazy and slightly disturbing things all the time. There is a cycle to these things, and actually people learn from these cycles, get insights into them, and in a way, instead of having this as a almost subculture, it gets exposed, it gets that kind of sunlight, and over a longer period horizon, I think what has credit stays, because when the next generation comes up, they are automatically there to mock the generation before them as old and kind of out of touch.
Yeah, well, my students are really interesting about social media. I teach. I don't teach social media. I teach a class about the ending of licensing in the 1640s, but I kind of make comparisons. We talk about social media because we talk about unlicensed printing, basically, and the explosion of that in the 1640s, and how that kind of has an affinity with what's happened with social media. It's just a good way of talking about stuff. But my current students, 18, 19, 20 now, are very cynical about social media. They're very interested about privacy. They're very interested about legitimacy. They're really interested about consent. All these things are things that are, I think, responses to the last 10 years worth, as you say. And I think that the new generation is more their understanding is with using this stuff but being quite careful of it. And I think that's the shift that I've seen, that my students don't. There was a thing about 10 years ago when the students didn't want to be on social media, and that sort of, they just were off it, or they were analog, they used big brick phones or whatever, or they did kind of mindful social media and things like that. Now students are on social media, but they're quite self-protective, they're quite careful, they're quite self-aware. So I think you're probably right that you get a shift toward a sophistication of engagement, which recognises the proliferation and finds a way of sifting it. Gaming is a really good example. Games are huge, and there were only 5 games in the world, and now there are so many millions of them. But people are really good at figuring out what they like and what they're good at, what they're interested in, and so the engagement with games my students have demonstrated over the last 20 years has gone from, I play everything, to I play this very sophisticated thing which allows me to think in this way, and so I think that shows how the engagement with things becomes more sophisticated quite quickly. As you say, each generation becomes, it queries what happened before.
I mean, I do want to talk about gaming, but I do have a slight disclaimer for anyone watching this. I am a decrepit old man, like I told you before, and I am a hopeless Luddite, and I have very little gaming knowledge, so forgive me if I get some of this wrong, but I'm going to stick to kind of some of the more mainstream games. Civilization, which is one of the games which is probably one of the few games that I had some sort of interaction with and very much enjoyed. It's the kind of strategy game. So you have these societies, they advance by acquiring technology, resources, territory, etc., etc. I'm sure people are better and more familiar with this than I am. I wonder to what degree these games reflect hard historical truths in the way that it deals with power and coercion, and how they place limits on what societies can do. So you need to be able to enforce your will in a kind of Melian dialogue type way. Or to what degree they're missing the cultural aspect, where there's no vacuum. So, for example, Christianity reshapes the Roman Empire, but there's no Melian hard power going on there. It's culture, and the same goes for a lot of other things in history that couldn't be explained by pure power politics, and maybe culture is a huge part. Or do you argue that maybe culture is actually second to the power? And how are these games and the rules of these games affecting how we understand history? And
Civilization is a really good example. Civilization is when Sid Meier first developed it in the late 80s, he conceived of it as an educational game, and it is a game that has been used repeatedly in the classroom, and it's been demonstrated as a very, very useful tool in the classroom because it teaches a kind of idea of of history as development. It's very teleological, still is. I mean, the more up-to-date or more updated versions are very much like you start here and you get to civilization, you actually progress towards civilization. So it has a very kind of clear sense that history is a set of movements toward a presumed sublimation at the end. But what I like about them is you can play all kinds of different ways and you can win all kinds of different ways. So you don't necessarily have to be the strongest. And sometimes being the strongest doesn't help. And as you're right, the soft power is much more important. So you can develop, Christianity, you can develop mass transit, you can develop music, you can build an orchestra, you can build an opera house, whatever. And all these things, I mean, it used to be that was quite mechanical and it would just demonstrate your level of civilization was demonstrated by your level of cultural civilization. Now you can elect to essentially go a cultural way and a trade way or a diplomatic way, and all these different versions of things suggest that decisions made then have implications, historical implications. And I think that basic premise is really quite useful for teaching people about how history works. It's completely different to other types of gaming because it's turn-based and teleological. Like I like Risk, for instance, or like chess. They are games which are turn-based, whereas if you think about open world games like Call of Duty isn't really open world, but Red Dead Redemption or something like, which is like you can play across the whole of this world and you can do whatever you want. You can go and sit on your horse for 5 days if you want to, or just go and go and eat or whatever. They have a much more different sense of your engagement, your involvement with history. Civilization is a game which tries to teach you how history happens, whereas the other games are more about what it's like to be in history, I guess. They're more immersive in that way. But yeah, Civilization is a fun game still to play, and that's another thing that's also lacking in history is fun. And that's maybe a bit unfair, but like the idea that you might enjoy this is something we've only really kind of got in the last 20 years got our heads around. That it might be people might want to like this stuff, or have an emotional connection with. Or, so gaming is something which I think, particularly for point of view gaming, it's very difficult not to have an emotional connection to it of a kind, bodily connection. That completely transforms the way you might think about what the past is, even. So, yeah, your question is Civilization. Civilization is a great game. It's a lot of fun and has been used, it's now quite an ancient game, to be honest, and has been used in teaching for about 15 years, if not longer, at multiple levels to sort of think about how do we understand history to work, what do we think history does, how do we think history happens, and it used to be very Eurocentric, they've changed that. It used to be very male, they've changed that. But yeah, it is more, it allows a kind of sophisticated version of understanding that actually soft power might be more important than military power.
I mean, I like the fact you mentioned fun. I think people forget that. I mean, history became interesting both because people were interested in how they could apply the past, maybe in a Machiavellian type way, but also because people loved this stuff. Books were relatively new as an idea that the average person could reach for a book and read Homer or read whatever, and it was fantastically fun. And I think people had this conception that people in the 1800s were all quite miserable, but actually, they were reading this stuff because this was fantastically interesting. And if gaming is the new way of, that's another way of having fun. But I do wonder how civilization weights power or weights, soft power. Are these historical claims being made by the people who are?
I can't tell you the detail of that. I haven't played the game in enough detail recently. Certainly, it has been a feature of the game since its inception that culture is significant and diplomacy is significant. So it's not just about, because there are other games. There's lots of games you can play on your phone, for instance, that are strategy games that are based on, paying money to get more, archers or whatever it is you need. There's a lot of kind of strategy games that are about just weight of numbers and power. And they're often in a kind of sort of idealized medieval space where you're basically trying to destroy this castle or whatever it is. So they're a different type of game. Whereas Civilization, the game, and other versions, there are multiple other versions like that. And indeed, there are quite a lot of big international games that are played on long term. bases, turn-based games. Those are, they are interested in the idea of soft power. But you should talk to Paul Wake from Manchester Met. He's the big game person. He'd be fun to talk to. I mean, I know you don't know anything about games. But
I was going to say I might be useless, but this could be an interesting research project.
He's got a whole study for the Centre for the Study of Games, and but they're really interested in the fact that actually, while civilization has been used in teaching, possibly because of the type of history it presents, other games aren't. I wouldn't go into a history class and assume that someone was going to bring in Assassin's Creed. Even though Assassin's Creed is incredibly influential in terms of how people understand and think about the past and are educated about it. Like I know people who know all about ancient Rome because they played Assassin's Creed, and they will talk about, how much it was how engaged they were in understanding about Machiavelli or whoever that they've learnt about in Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed actually is a really good educational thing. I mean, you have to kill everyone, but that's it's not necessarily. That's not. Can you get through Assassin's Creed without killing everyone? I don't think you can. So you still have to kill people. So it's still premised on killing people, which is what most games up until about 5 years ago were about.
I mean, at the risk of sounding very old, I've spoken to quite a few undergraduates who really have become engaged in history and very, very knowledgeable about really quite niche detail from being massive gamers. So there is an upside.
Absolutely, it's really, really influential how much it can do, and games are increasingly recognising that. Assassin's Creed knows that it's influential. Call of Duty was really bothered about accuracy when it first came out. Was really concerned about accuracy, and they would they had historical consultants and stuff like this, and they still do. And in fact, the idea of being an historical consultant on a game is now a kind of
it's a job,
rather than when it used to be. It was like, why is this person working with these game people? What's this about? Games are respectable in like I was talking about at the beginning. This type of engagement with the past is respectable. And one of the things that's happened with games is a proliferation of them. So you don't have to play the game where you kill everyone. You can play the game where you deal with everyone, or you reenact scientific discovery or whatever it might be. So the diversification of the game space has meant that you've got much more interesting complications around it.
I mean, I might get a career change because this could be a way to explain to my wife why I need to be playing games.
Absolutely.
So, I'm doing research.
I do a lot of research like that when I went to see Odyssey a couple of weeks ago. I was like, this is research.
So bringing it back sort of to this idea of the different ways in which people are interacting with history. We have a very famous case of a woman called Janet Stevens, who was a hairdresser, and she began testing all these elaborate Roman hairstyles that she had seen on sculptures, and because history had become so accessible to the average person, sparked her interest, and then she tried to recreate them, and she is now the authority on Roman hairstyles. She published an article.
Oh my God. Yeah, I've just found it.
Yeah, she published an article in the Journal of Roman Archaeology, and she's she basically figured out how it's incredible. I was wondering what this example really reveals about the forms of expertise that institutions and universities find difficult to recognise. And again, this is another angle on the conversation we were having about the democratisation. I mean, how amazing is that? I mean, for those,
I think that's astonishing. That's very pleasing to me.
So we used to think that hair had to be that these were wigs in some way, or like hair was attached, but she's figured out that actually there was a lot of strings and tying and clips, and it's very interesting. Like I say, it's something I discovered online, read the paper, and it's just
I'm totally stealing that. Sorry, that's
all
brilliant.
yours.
That's making me very happy. What was the question? Sorry.
Well, I was wondering what something like that reveals about the kinds of expertise that maybe the academies are missing and will find difficult to recognise, and how this democratisation, yes, with all its problems, really has the opportunity for us to unveil loads of new and interesting discoveries.
Well, so there are two really good examples to draw out to talk about that. The first is reenactment, which I've already mentioned, and the second is genealogy, both of which are huge mass leisure pursuits, historical adjacent, historical specific, which have still been under-theorised by the Academy, still been seen as relatively suspicious by the Academy, And I find them fascinating because they are multiply fascinating in terms of how people engage with the past and what type of engagement they have, from family history, genealogy, where you're thinking about your own kind of sense of self and how that might be changed by some work that you might do in the archive, to reenactment, where you're basically conceiving of an engagement with the past which is physical and real and not. So there is some theorization of reenactment. Most of the work on reenactment comes from performance studies and drama. There's not very much by historians. Historians I think still think that reenactment is a bit silly and a bit weird. But if you go into any museum, they'll have some form of reenactment, and most historical TV and documentary has some form of reenactment. In fact, historical film is reenactment, historical TV is reenactment. All these things are basically versions of it. But what we've learned from reenactors is multiple about the kind of just the physical experience of carrying your kit, or making this thing, or being ill, or whatever it might be. There are all kinds of really interesting and useful stories that come out of that.
A form of experimental archaeology.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I have to shout out Andy Fair in the Roman department of Ancient History. He's involved in reenactment, and he's a very serious professor. And this stuff really does inform sometimes.
100%. Yeah, we had a PhD student with him about 10 years ago that we funded, and she made a trebuchet. That was her work, and she made a working one, which is like, this is a weapon. Are you sure you should be doing this? She had all kinds of ethical discussions around that. But genealogy and family history is a similarly kind of like massive thing, a whole genre of its own in terms of how people know the past, a whole documentary genre in terms of something like Who Do You Think You Are, or Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s work in the US. And so you've got this whole kind of level of people understanding the past through family history and investing in their family history. Massive boom in it. If you go to any local history office now, there will be a family history bit, and that will be oversubscribed, and the rest of the archive won't be being used at all. So historians sometimes grumble about that, which is fair enough as well. But there's very little engagement with the family historians other than using them as a kind of as a resource. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people out there who know so much more than anyone will ever know about this little area here, or this name here, or this word. And that's not really. I mean, so this Manchester and Lancashire Family History Society is based in the library down the way. I could guarantee if you went down to the Central Library now, there'll be 20 people in there working on some kind of history, and they would know stuff that there's no way we would ever know.
And then they hop on Reddit or some other sort of blogging site or whatever, and amazing discoveries and amazing
stuff out.
Amazingly interesting stuff that you can read from random people whose names you'll never know, with amazing information on all sorts of topics.
And so so we were talking about amateur historians and who qualifies as being an historian in terms of the democratization of history. All of those people, the reenactors and the genealogists, are much more akin to historians because they have a set of practices and rules and codes and ethics. I mean, they do what historians do, or what historians think they should be doing. They just do it in a slightly different space, but they are very precise and careful about the way in which they might work in a way that we might think other democratized history doesn't have that kind of set of practices or that template of approach. Certainly, quite a lot of family historians I talk to have done incredible amounts of training and have really and the training has been internal, so it's not been taught by anyone apart from their community. Same as reenactors, they'll upskill one another, they'll talk to one another. They will engage with certain historians, but very few.
And I've seen recently people who are skilled in sensory archaeology, so they use all sorts of LIDAR and other things, and they're discovering incredible things in the landscape. It's on YouTube. It's a whole kind of subgenre that exists.
That's super cool. And I've already talked about metal detecting quite several times, and metal detecting to me is a brilliant example of this. It's a kind of, it's maligned to a certain extent as a hobby and a silly hobby, but actually it has opened up multiple huge archaeological finds over the last 30, 40 years, by people who are incredibly thoughtful and skilled about what they do and know exactly what it is and are very, very smart and know a lot about the local area and about the earth in their local area and they know about migration and movement and all kinds of historical stuff, which is significantly important. But then they'll have that kind of like knowledge, and that knowledge won't be accessible in any way. It will just be sat in their local club or whatever it is.
Well, I want to add to the defense of metal detectors because I did a data analysis project on the PSA, which is basically a place where people who find coins, and to the credit of the community, they find this stuff and they hand it in. And we have amazing amounts of information, data now, because everyone who hands something in, they'll tell the PSA exactly where they found it. Obviously, a lot of that data is not public. But what is public is the general find, the general areas and stuff. And you can then figure out, okay, from the patterns in the data, or what was the flow of money like, or questions about who was burying stuff when and where, and the circulation of coinage in these periods, and I mean all sorts of really very interesting things.
Cool. That's so cool. And that kind of there was a academic movement in the 60s called local history, and there was a kind of movement toward that, and there was also social history and labour history and women's history. All these types of historiographical shifts have been interested in different types of community groups contributing much more, or being or participating or being involved. But I'm being glib when I talk about historians not engaging with these communities, but it's much less the case that those types of history would be seen as legitimate. When I teach public history, I oftentimes will teach genealogy, and the students will be mildly, kind of eyebrows raised about this being a form of history, and I'm like, this is definitely history. This is definitely a historical practice. But I'm going to have to go in a minute.
All right. Well, let's wrap this up. Like I say, I knew from the beginning there would be no way I'd even get through half.
I'm so sorry.
I have to be. I am. A quarter of the way through the
oh my God.
the questions.
Okay, right, yeah.
So yeah, it was always going to be one of these fantastically fun and interesting podcasts. So yeah, I do really have to thank you for coming on.
You're very welcome. It's been a lot of fun to talk about.
Amazing.
I still need to figure out some answers to some of your questions as well, which is going to take me a while. So thank you.
So really much appreciated. Thank you very much, Jerome. Thank you.
Cheers.